They told me a black woman had no place running a trauma center. Today, as I hold their lives in my hands, they're about to learn how wrong they were. The morning started like any other at Metropolitan General Hospital. The emergency room buzzed with its usual controlled chaos as I, Dr. Maya Richardson, prepared for my first official day as Chief of Trauma Surgery. 20 years of dedication had led to this moment, countless sleepless nights, 3 advanced degrees, and more sacrifices than I could count. But as I straightened my white coat and checked my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. I'd already overheard the whispers. Dr. William Harrison, who'd been passed over for the position, had made his opinions crystal clear to anyone who would listen. "Diversity hire," he'd sneered when he thought I couldn't hear. "Wait until she cracks under real pressure." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd graduated top of my class at Johns Hopkins while working 2 jobs to support my younger siblings after our parents died. I'd completed my residency at Mass General, where I'd pioneered a new emergency thoracotomy technique that was now standard practice across the country. But to some, all they saw was the color of my skin. At 7:43 a.m., everything changed. The emergency radio crackled to life. Multiple casualty incident, high-speed collision on the interstate. 5 critical patients incoming, including 2 children. As I rushed to the ambulance bay, I could feel Harrison's eyes boring into my back, waiting for me to falter. The first ambulance screamed to a stop. EMTs rushed out with a young boy, maybe 6 years old, his small body bloody and broken. "Massive internal bleeding," they reported, "BP dropping rapidly." I was calling out orders when the second ambulance arrived. The doors flew open, and my heart stopped. On the stretcher lay Dr. Harrison's wife, Sarah, her pregnant belly distended and rigid, clear signs of internal bleeding. Behind her, their teenage daughter, Emma, was being wheeled in, unconscious with a severe head injury. Harrison's face went pale. For the first time since I'd known him, the arrogance drained away, replaced by raw fear. Our eyes met across the chaos of the emergency room. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking, "save them." The next 4 hours became a blur of split-second decisions and precise movements. I moved between 3 operating rooms, directing my teams, my mind processing hundreds of variables simultaneously. Sarah's placenta had detached. We had minutes to save both her and the baby. Emma's intracranial pressure was rising dangerously. The young boy had a lacerated liver that wouldn't stop bleeding. I felt the weight of every decision, knowing Harrison was watching my every move through the observation windows. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and lives would be lost. But this was what I was born to do. At one point, while racing between ORs, I passed the hospital's wall of chiefs, decades of stern white men staring down at me. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "Maya, baby, they're going to tell you that you don't belong. Your job isn't to prove them wrong. Your job is to be so good they look foolish for ever doubting you." Inside OR 1, Sarah's surgery reached a critical point. Her blood pressure was crashing, and the baby's heartbeat was growing weaker. I had seconds to make a decision that would affect 3 lives: Sarah's, the baby's, and Harrison's. 20 years of experience, thousands of hours of study, and every hardship I'd overcome led to this moment. "Scalpel," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. The entire OR held its breath as I began a procedure I'd developed but had never performed in such extreme circumstances. One wrong move and everything would be lost. Through the observation window, I could see Harrison slump against the wall, his face buried in his hands. The man who'd spent months trying to undermine me was now praying for me to succeed. 4 excruciating hours later, I stepped out of OR 1, my surgical gown stained with blood despite multiple changes. The hallway was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the controlled chaos that had just unfolded behind those doors. Harrison stood there, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from worry. "Your wife is stable," I said, removing my surgical cap. "We managed to stop the bleeding and save the baby. Your daughter Emma's intracranial pressure has normalized, though the next 24 hours will be critical." Harrison's legs gave out, and he sank into a nearby chair. The mighty had fallen, but I took no pleasure in his vulnerability. Instead, I found myself thinking about a conversation I'd had with my grandmother years ago on her porch in South Carolina. "Baby girl," she'd said, sipping her sweet tea, "there's going to come a day when someone who hurt you needs your help. That's when you'll show them who you really are." But before Harrison could speak, a nurse rushed up. "Dr. Richardson, there's something you need to see about the young boy from the accident." I followed her to the pediatric ICU where 6-year-old Marcus lay surrounded by machines. While reviewing his charts, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The experimental treatment we'd used to save his life, a protocol I'd developed during my research years, was being challenged by the hospital board. Leading the challenge, Dr. William Harrison. The document in my hands showed that Harrison had filed a formal complaint just yesterday, claiming my treatment protocols were unnecessarily risky and should be suspended. If he'd succeeded, Marcus would have died today. The very procedure he tried to discredit had just saved his own family. As I stood there processing this information, Marcus's mother arrived, Dr. Angela Chen, a renowned neuroscientist I'd collaborated with at Johns Hopkins. She took one look at me and knew. "Maya, what are you doing here?" The pieces clicked into place. Angela had been my mentor, the woman who'd inspired me to push boundaries in medicine. We'd lost touch after she moved west, but her research had paved the way for many of my breakthroughs. "The protocol we developed together," I said softly, "it saved your son today." Angela's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Marcus's stabilizing vital signs. They told me it was too experimental, too dangerous, that I was crazy to even consider it. "They were wrong," I replied, thinking of Harrison's complaint, "but there's something else you need to know." Just then, Harrison appeared in the doorway. His face went ashen when he saw Angela. 20 years ago, before he'd built his reputation at Metropolitan General, he'd been a junior researcher at Johns Hopkins. He'd tried to take credit for Angela's groundbreaking work, nearly derailing her career. She'd fought back and exposed his attempted theft, but the experience had driven her away from the East Coast medical community. "William," Angela said, her voice ice cold, "still trying to suppress innovations that aren't yours?" Harrison looked from Angela to me, then to Marcus's monitors showing the success of the very protocol he'd tried to shut down. The protocol that had not only saved Angela's son, but had given him the expertise needed to save his own family today. The weight of it all seemed to crash down on him at once. His carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice was crumbling. Every assumption he'd made, every obstacle he'd tried to place in my path, had led to this moment of brutal clarity. But there was no time for confrontation. Marcus's latest scan showed a complication that required immediate attention. As I prepared to head back into surgery, Harrison spoke up. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent 20 years being exactly the kind of doctor I swore I'd never become. While you were innovating and saving lives, I was protecting my territory. Today, you saved my family using methods I tried to discredit out of pure spite." I paused at the OR doors, thinking of all the times I'd wanted to confront him, to demand recognition for my achievements. But looking at him now, I saw something I'd never expected, a chance for real change. The next 12 hours tested every ounce of my training and resolve. Marcus's condition took an unexpected turn. His body was rejecting the synthetic grafts we'd used to repair his liver. As I scrubbed in for what would be my third surgery of the day, the hospital board chairman, Dr. Theodore Walsh, appeared in the prep room. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "I've just received some concerning information about your unauthorized use of experimental protocols." I continued scrubbing, counting each stroke as I'd done thousands of times before. "With all due respect, Dr. Walsh, I have a 6-year-old fighting for his life. Whatever administrative concerns you have can wait." "This isn't just administrative," he pressed. "Harrison's complaint was withdrawn." A voice interrupted. Harrison stood in the doorway, still wearing the same wrinkled clothes from earlier. "I'm formally withdrawing my complaint and submitting a letter of commendation for Dr. Richardson's pioneering work." Walsh's face reddened. "William, you were quite adamant yesterday about the risks." "Yesterday, I was wrong," Harrison cut in. "And if you check your emails, you'll find documentation from Dr. Chen. Yes, that Dr. Chen, supporting every aspect of these protocols. The same protocols that saved my wife, my daughter, and my unborn child." Before Walsh could respond, monitors began blaring from Marcus's room. I rushed past both men, my mind already focused on the challenge ahead. But as I reached the OR doors, I heard Harrison say something that stopped me cold. "She's not just a better doctor than me, Ted. She's the kind of doctor we all pretend to be. Inside the OR, time seemed to bend and stretch. Marcus's condition was deteriorating faster than our instruments could measure. Traditional approaches weren't working, and I could feel the team's confidence wavering. That's when I remembered something from my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. The church had been packed with people whose lives she'd touched during her 40 years as a midwife in rural South Carolina. One story kept coming up, how she'd combined traditional healing knowledge passed down through generations with modern medical understanding. Wisdom, she'd told me once, doesn't care what package it comes in. Looking at Marcus's failing vitals, I made a decision that would either save his life or end my career. I called for ingredients that hadn't been used in a modern OR in decades. Natural compounds my grandmother had taught me about, ones I'd spent years studying and validating through research, but had never dared use in practice. Dr. Richardson, the surgical resident, whispered, "This isn't in any standard protocol." Neither was being the first black female chief of trauma, I replied, my hand steady as I worked. Sometimes you have to trust more than just what's written in books. The next 40 minutes were the longest of my career. I could feel Walsh watching from the observation window, probably already drafting my termination letter, but something remarkable was happening. Marcus's numbers were stabilizing. The natural compounds were working in perfect synergy with our modern techniques, creating a bridge that allowed his body to accept the synthetic grafts. As we closed, Angela burst into the observation room. She'd been analyzing the preliminary data from Marcus's treatment. "Maya," her voice cracked over the intercom, "you just bridged a gap that's plagued transplant medicine for decades. Do you realize what this means?" I did. It meant that my grandmother's wisdom, combined with decades of modern medical research, had just opened a door that could save countless lives. But it also meant something more immediate. It meant that every attempt to diminish, discourage, or dismiss me had failed not just because of my determination, but because I'd stayed true to all parts of who I was. 2 months later, I stood at the podium of the National Medical Conference in Chicago, facing an audience of 5,000 healthcare professionals. Among them sat Dr. Harrison, Dr. Walsh, and most surprisingly, my entire surgical team, who'd flown in for this moment despite my protests. "Medicine," I began, "isn't just about what we know. It's about being humble enough to acknowledge what we don't know." The presentation screen behind me showed 2 images, a page from my grandmother's handwritten remedy book and the groundbreaking cellular imaging that proved why her methods worked. The research paper I was presenting, combining traditional healing wisdom with cutting-edge medical science, had just been acclaimed as the year's most significant breakthrough in transplant medicine. But as I prepared to continue, an urgent message appeared on my phone. Back at Metropolitan General, a mass casualty event was unfolding. A train derailment had left dozens critically injured, and they needed every experienced trauma surgeon. I looked up at the audience, at the prestigious award waiting to be presented, at the career-defining moment I'd worked 20 years to achieve. Then I thought of Marcus, now fully recovered and back in school, who'd drawn me a picture of what he wanted to be when he grew up. A doctor who, in his words, helps people like Dr. Maya does. "I apologize," I said, closing my laptop, "but there are patients who need me more than you need my speech." As I stepped down from the podium, Harrison stood up. "I'll fly you back on my private jet. We can be there in 90 minutes. The same man who'd once called me a diversity hire was now standing beside me as we rushed through the airport. But something else happened during that flight that would change Metropolitan General forever. "Maya," Harrison said, his voice heavy with decades of realization, "I've been chief of staff for 15 years. Tomorrow morning, I'm recommending you for the position." I looked at him sharply. "I don't need your help, William." "This isn't help," he replied. "This is recognition. Long overdue recognition. But more importantly, this is about every young black girl who walks into our hospital and needs to see that excellence knows no color. Just like my daughter Emma, who told me yesterday she wants to apply to medical school because of you." We landed to find the emergency department in carefully controlled chaos. As I rushed in, I saw Dr. Walsh struggling to manage the overflow of patients. But something was different. He was following the organizational protocols I'd implemented months ago, the same ones he'd initially resisted. For the next 16 hours, we worked non-stop. Every surgeon, nurse, and staff member moved with precision, using the integrated system of modern medicine and traditional wisdom I'd developed. Lives were saved not because of individual brilliance, but because we'd finally learned to respect and combine different forms of knowledge. As the last critical patient stabilized, I found myself back in the same break room where Harrison had once tried to undermine me. But now, posted on the wall, was a framed copy of my grandmother's remedy book, right next to the latest medical journals. Dr. Richardson, a young black resident, approached me, her eyes shining with determination. "I just wanted to say, seeing you as chief of surgery, it means everything." I smiled, remembering all the doors that had been closed to me, all the battles I'd fought. "The door is open now," I told her. "Your job is to keep it open for those coming after you." That evening, as I finally headed home, I passed by Marcus's recovered room. He'd left something on the bed, a new drawing. It showed two figures in white coats. One was him in the future, and the other was me, standing side by side as equals. If you've ever faced someone who doubted you, who tried to define your limits, remember this: excellence doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for acceptance. It simply is. And when you stay true to who you are, when you lift as you climb, you don't just break barriers, you make them irrelevant. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, when did someone underestimate you? And how did you prove them wrong? Let's share our stories of breaking barriers and lifting others as we climb.